You know, the beauty of the coast was astonishing. And there's a lot of very good people, that work on the coast. My name is Michael Terry Davis, and I live in Vancouver. I was born in Vancouver, and I've been on the coast since the early 80s, on the water since the early 80s. I'd always wanted to work. There was something about, when I was a kid, I read about boats and, you know, liners and the history, and I'd always been intrigued by that idea, and I loved what I had seen of the coast. It never occurred to me that I would be working in one of the most uptight, homophobic, uh, backward industries. It never occurred to me. And all of a sudden, there I am, and I was like, "Ooh, this is different." I never imagined that anybody would, do a queer at sea thing, because, like I say, it was not mentioned, it was not talked about. But then later on, with the Mithril on the way back from Alaska, I'd run into like a fleet of like 8 boats that were all flying the gay flag, and ended up meeting a whole bunch of people. So by the mid '90s, there was actually a few gay guys, and there was 3 boats there that were women, and so we actually ended up having quite a little community. Yes, David, my first lover. We met on Wreck Beach. Um, I was I think I was just about to turn 20. I think I was like it was like 2 weeks before I was turning 20. He was the same age as me, and we met on Wreck Beach, and yeah. So for work, I had to come up. I mean, my whole demeanor changed, right? I went from being this kind of sullen loner kind of person to all of a sudden being very happy and smiley, and so I mean there had to be a reason, right? So at work he was known as Jennifer. That was what I told people, that I'd met this person named Jennifer, because nobody was out. I mean we're talking 1982, and uh, towboaters and launch guys, they were, sort of one step above longshoremen as far as liberal attitudes, and it simply was not discussed. There was absolutely no way you could possibly even think about coming out. That I never heard anything about gay, nothing. That was it. Uh, Not even to the point of, you know, deriding it. Like it was not there. And yeah, it never occurred to me to come out there. It was a really, that would have been a very scary thing to do. And then the irony was that Jennifer, my first lover, David, needed a job, and I said, well, you could come work as a night dispatcher. And so at one point they had 3 gay guys working for this little tiny launch firm, but they didn't even know it. There was one guy, his name is Dave, and he was quite a bit older than me. And we ended up being sort of buddies for a while. And he once told me the 2 worst things on a ship were a thief and a fag. And then we sort of became buddies. He was a really unusual character. He was about, I would say I was in my early 20s, and I would say Dave was probably, I don't know, 35, maybe 35 to 40. And he had a junk, like a junk operation, and a little tug, and but we became kind of chums, and we got fairly drunk one night, and he started telling me the story about he'd been working for a company, which, well, I will not name, and they were going to, him and the owner of the company, who was a legend in the towboat industry, like a god. He's been featured in many books. He had a family. I knew his sons, who were grown men when I knew them. And anyways, they went to pick up this boat, and he took Dave with him. Dave was a young man at that time. And when they were coming back, because there was only 2 of them on this very large tug, they were going to pull into a cove and spend the night at the cove, and the whole boat was cold. So the captain said, well, you can sleep in my cabin, and because the stove was going in there. And halfway through the night, the captain tried to put the make on my friend, and he got very upset and got up and walked out. And I was shocked when he told me this story because, like I say, this man was a god in the towboat industry. I survived by becoming a caricature of the people around me. I mean, I swore more than they did, and you know, I really did become like a caricature of them, which was problematic later on in life because if you get me angry, I still swear like a trucker. Well, worse than a trucker, I swear like a towboater, which is not a good thing in a professional situation. It was interesting because you really did, it became like a real double life. Like my my lover David, he would not speak to me for 20 minutes after I came home from work because he just was like, "I'm not talking to you," because I was so, the language was so off the top, and he just wouldn't talk to me. And so there was this real weird kind of disconnect, right? But my first job out of when I graduated high school, so it was 1982, and I started working for a little freighting company called Nimrod Marine Services. And my girlfriend at the time, it was her cousin that owned the company. So they had two boats, little sea trucks they were called, with a little like a ramp at the front and flat bottomed, and they carried oil drums to there used to be five oil barges in Vancouver Harbor, so we used to take the oil drums out to that, and we used to run up to McNabb Creek, which still is actually a logging camp up at the top of Howe Sound, and Port Mellon Mill, and cabins that were being built and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, it was a little freighting company. It was a very small company, and it was actually very uncomfortable working there. There was two other guys working there, and they were really, one of them was really, really mean. Like so bad that I used to have nightmares about working. I'd go home at night and I'd have these nightmares about, trying to do stuff. And he was really mean. The other guy, who there's a picture of, was quite charming and not bad looking either. So I left there, and then I went to work for an outfit called Timac Launch. And Timac Launch services the deep sea ships at anchor, mostly people. So bringing in, crew for shore leave, taking out boarding parties with Department of Agriculture and Department of Transportation and Customs and ship chandlers, and you drift around out there for an hour and a half, and then you bring them all back. And we also took the pilots out. And then, so I started running launches for them, and then I started running a little tug and barge for them, because they also used to take fresh water out to the deep seas. And eventually ran a packer that they had called the Millbank 4, which was like 100-foot long fish packer. And the union got me onto a Shields Navigation, which was a little, not really little, but it was like I don't know, they had like 5 boats maybe. So I went to work for them, and mostly oil barges and running oil up and down the coast. And I was a cook. I was a cook deckhand. And I'd never cooked, professionally for anyone in my life. And I arrived on this thing, and not only was I a cook, but it had an oil stove. I was horrified. I had no idea. And yeah, you learned pretty quick. It was a very good experience. Like I eventually got onto a boat called the Haida Chieftain. It was a deep sea salvage tug. It was 120 feet long, and the main deck at the bow was like 2 or 3 decks above the water, and then there was 2 more up to the wheelhouse. It was a big, big boat. And we used to get into all these little places because she would tow this 360-foot log barge called the Haida Carrier, which was one of the very first self-dumping, self-loading log barges. And she was a little freaky because they hadn't quite figured out all of the balance and stuff, and so you had to load her just right. They have tipping tanks on one side of them, and so you open a valve and these tanks fill with water, and the whole thing kind of leans over, and then it's kind of like stepping on a bar of soap. Eventually the logs stay in the same place and the barge just slips out from underneath them, so you got a 360-foot barge leaping sideways like, I don't know, 90 feet maybe. And it's very dramatic. I loved it because you got to go into all these little. So you got the big outfits like C-SPAN or Kinkham, and they're going to big logging operations. we just got the little Jippo guys. Like there was this one guy we used to go into, and it was a father and his two sons, and they'd spend like a year, 2 years, hand logging a really steep slope. It'd take them 2 years to put together a boom, and then we'd come in and pick it all up and be gone in a day. And so it was really interesting work. Well, Timac had a couple of very. It was a family owned business, and the father had built this thing out of a nothing little. It was like one or two boats when he got it, and by the time I was there, they had a fleet of, I don't know, 10 or 15 boats. And then his son had come to run it, and he was a bully. He was a real bully. And they'd set up, I can't remember when, but for a couple of years or 3 years, they'd had a Christmas bonus. And so we were getting into December, and the guys were all starting to talk about the Christmas bonus. And all of a sudden, management said, "There's no Christmas bonus this year." And they were like, "What do you mean?" And they said, I can't remember what they said first, but they changed the story. The first time they said, "Wow, there's no profits this year," and the next time they said something else. And so the guys were furious, and they were bitching and complaining, and they had tried to unionize once before, and they had not got there. They'd missed by one or two in the certification vote. And I actually wanted to leave. I wanted to go on the outside boats because you could only build up so much sea time working inside the harbors, and then you had to go outside the harbors to continue to build your sea time if you wanted to be a mate or a skipper or whatever. And so I wanted to go on the outside boat, which meant going union. And so I said, "Well, we could always union." They were like, yeah, that's what we should do. And so I went and talked to the CBRT, the Canadian Brotherhood of Railway and Transport Workers. And they were like, "Yeah, we'd love to, take another run at this." And so we spent 6 months getting certified, which we won. And then we had to negotiate a contract. And by the end of the 6 months, I really couldn't tell you which I found more irritating, the management or the staff, because the staff were all like, "Yeah, but when it came to, coming to meetings or doing a strike vote, or they were just terrible. They were just like, it was just unbelievable." We got our first contract signed, and the very next day I quit. Just so he knew it was personal. And the only other gay thing that I remember was a guy that I met through a friend of mine who was, again, he was probably 20 years older than I was, and he had a friend who worked for Kinkham Navigation, which was the maritime arm of Macmillan Bloedel. And it was all, 90% of it was log tows or log barges. And he was a cook, and he was union, would have been the CBRT at the time. And one day the deckhand was sick, and so he was supposed to be the deckhand. And this guy was, he was very skinny, he was very flamboyant, but he was union, so you couldn't, if he had a certain amount of seniority, you couldn't just get rid of him, right? And so I remember the only story I'd ever heard about him working was he was sitting in the wheelhouse, and they were up the river somewhere, and the captain pulled the boat alongside a log tow. And log tows, of course, are held together by boomsticks around the outside, and then there's a very heavy chain with a ring and a toggle, right? And you drop the toggle through the end of the boomstick and through another one, and then you put the toggle through the ring and you flip it, and that's how it holds the whole thing together. And the captain's like, "Okay, go down there and get that chain and put those toggles on that end and put that together." And this guy looked at him and he said, "No," he says, "there's two things I don't do, whips and chains." So this would have been when I was working for Nimrod Marine. And it was an old fish boat. It was called the Bricko 16. And it had been built by a Japanese guy. And then before he ever put it in the water, it was seized when they interned all the Japanese. And then BC Tel took it and turned it into a cable tender, when they had all these telephone cables all over the place. And they'd have this whole little fleet of boats, all called the Bricko something. And she was the Bricko 16. And she used to go out and, I don't know, check cables and stuff. So when I got her, she had a little cabin. She was frighteningly ugly. But she was quite sturdy and fairly inexpensive. And I took her in the early 80s before GPS and all this sort of stuff. I got her all the way to the top end of Vancouver Island and through the Yucatah Rapids and up into the jungles, and never ran into any gay people, or I had some, I had lots of gay friends that would come out on the boat with us, but it was all pretty, pretty quiet. And then I sold her. I swore I'd never get another boat. Um, because I actually had two friends out on her, and we'd gone through this really tricky little pass between what was called Cooper Island. It's now Peneluket, but Cooper Island and Thetis Island, there's a very narrow little boat pass there. And I got her through there, and I was all proud of myself, and I was off doing other things, and my buddies were driving the boat, and they slammed her up over a reef down the other side. And after that, she always leaked. And so one day she was sitting at Mosquito Creek on the North Van, and she sank at the dock. And I had no money. I mean, I was like 19 years old, and I'd been, I was in debt up to here when I got it. And after that, it just got worse. And this guy called me up and he said, "I'll buy it where is as is for $1." And I was like, sold. Buddy, a gay friend of mine, an older man, we were just monkeying around, wandering around up in Port Moody, and saw this really cute little 26-foot, tiny little thing. 26-footed, it used to be a school boat for the Gulf Islands. And somebody had converted it into a little cruiser. It had a 1949 Chrysler Crown gas engine in it. And I loved it. I thought it was absolutely adorable. And it had just failed a survey. Somebody had made an offer on it and then got it surveyed. And you could literally push your thumb through the back of the wheelhouse. It was so rotten. And so I bought it for like $8,000. It was cheap, cheap, cheap. And I was going to cruise it for a year and then burn it, but I loved the boat so much. And so I decided to rebuild it. Coast and also ended up meeting quite a few gay guys. In 1993, I had pulled into the Maritime Museum harbor. They have a little heritage harbor at the entrance to False Creek. And there was this very good looking guy on this really old boat, like really old. And I pulled up alongside, and we started chitter-chattering, and he was really friendly, so I pulled alongside. And the boat was called the Rheingold, and it was built in 1911, and it was absolutely immaculate. It was like a little jewel box. And his name was Brent, and I thought he was absolutely adorable. And then this other guy showed up, and I was kind of like, who's he? And that was his partner. They'd been together for 14 years. And he ended up becoming a very good friend, and I ended up actually working for him. And it turned out that he had worked for the Coast Guard as well. So he was one of the very few commercial maritime guys that I knew that was gay. And we became lifelong friends. So I sold her and started looking out for a fish boat. Couldn't find one. And my mom and her husband were out wandering around Victoria, actually, Saanich, I think. And they found this beautiful boat that had a brand new diesel engine in it. And so bought that and called her the Sylvia Rose, because my mother's name is Sylvia and I'm a mama's boy. And so she was called the Sylvia Rose. And took her all over the place. Took her around Vancouver Island, took her out onto the west coast of the Charlottes, explored the mid-coast. And it was like, what do I do with this fish boat that can go anywhere? But I don't have the time anymore, so I sold her. Swore I'd never have another boat, certainly not a wood one. And then in 2010, everybody else was all excited about the Olympics, and I was wandering around Victoria and found this beautiful, beautiful little sailboat called the Nightwind, and she had been designed and built by a quite renowned Pacific Coast designer named Frank Fredette. She was a piece of business, I'd handled, like, I can do a tug and 2 barges behind and land both of them, and I can handle boats. And she made me look like a rank amateur. He would, you'd be coming to the dock, and the wind would go, and she had all these huge sails way up on a bowsprit, and she'd just pivot and go off and she'd crush the dinghy against the dock. She was just unbelievable. But she was very pretty. And me and my mother's husband at the time, David, we spent, I don't know, a year and a half maybe. Yeah, because I bought it in '93. So, anyways, we spent like a year rebuilding it. And the justification for all of this was that I was going to take it to Alaska. So in, I don't know, April, I think it was, early April of 1995, I started puttering off in this thing. And I would have friends, friends would do, a section of it. I had a friend who rode up to Lund with me, and then I was alone all the way up to Port Hardy, and my brother came on board there. And we went across Cape Caution, and my brother was really freaked out because it was like 12 days and we never saw another human being. Almost no structures, like nothing. And he was really freaked out. You couldn't get the radio, you couldn't get, you couldn't listen to hockey. He was really weirded out. And then we arrived at the Bella Bella band store on St. Patrick's Day. It was very strange. That was one of the very first places that on the way north at Bella Bella, I ran into a fish boat that had three guys on it, three young, good-looking guys, and they were flying the gay flag. I'd never seen that on a commercial boat before. So this is '95, and yeah, I was all excited about that. I was kind of following them around the Bella Bella band store, but they were going south and I was going north, so that was the end of that. Anyways, he went off and I kept on going. We got up to Juneau, Alaska, and a couple of friends flew up there. My older friend Hal and a young guy, he flew up. And in Juneau, I think we went to the public pool in Juneau, Alaska, and we noticed these two guys, and they were like checking us out. We're like, okay, this may be Juneau, but I'm pretty sure they're cruising. So sure enough, they were gay, and we ended up going for dinner, and they were quite nice. But yeah, that was about the only gay that we ran into up in Alaska. I remember we were once in Pirates Cove in DeCourcy, which is like it's like high-end trailer trash, right? Like it's all these like $1 million yachts, and they're all camping, and it's all about how big is your engine. But that's a whole other thing. But anyways, we were all there. We were all rafted together. And wood boats, they're not worth anything, but they're very pretty. And it was three wood boats, the Rheingold and the Dulwin, which was a 1950s, looked like a Chris Craft, but it was a much better quality boat than a Chris Craft, and my boat. But it was all gay guys. And it was, Sunday, so you could hear a pin drop like 6 miles away. And there's oh, what's her name? The opera star just blaring off of one of the boats, and we're all sitting there sipping our espressos, and I'm like, nobody knows we're gay.